Kia ora, my name's Amanda Bradley, and I'm the host of the Holistic Human podcast. And today I'm talking to you about the Easter Festival and Waldorf education because it's almost Easter here and it's autumn in the Southern Hemisphere. And I always get contemplative around festival times, especially those that have been traditionally tied to a certain season. And it doesn't necessarily match what I'm experiencing seasonally down in the South. And it then sparks a whole lot of other questions, which is good. So join me on this little mini solo podcast as I explore the deeper meaning of Easter and Waldorf education, and question how we can bring this to students who don't have a Christian faith or background. Because let's face it, billions of people across the world do not have that worldview. And if we want Steiner Waldorf education to continue to grow and flourish and prosper, we need to have these conversations to work out how we can be inclusive, respectful, and celebrate festivals at an interfaith level. Important interfaith stuff. Right. So I'm going to start with a little quote about what anthroposophy is, which kind of underpins the whole purpose and foundation of anthroposophical movements like Waldorf education. So anthroposophy is a path of knowledge which seeks to unite what is spiritual in the human being with what is spiritual in the universe. A path of knowledge which seeks to unite what is spiritual in the human being with what is spiritual in the universe. Ultimately, I think all religious and spiritual paths are aiming to do that. What we do as human beings, which is completely normal, is that we wrap these kind of practices and belief systems around this mission to unite the spiritual within ourselves with what's spiritual in the universe. And so we all have different ways of explaining it. And I think that's where religion and faith and spirituality, spiritual beliefs kind of stem from. And that's not to say that they're made up or anything, because I think there is truth to much of it. But yeah, I think we're all trying to do the same thing ultimately. So let's take this as our starting point. And I'm assuming most of you are listening because we share an interest in Waldorf education and or anthroposophy. And the following reflections are personal and not necessarily reflective of the Anthroposophical Society or anything, although I am part of it. I'm just on my own path of learning, and this is a snapshot of my thoughts currently on Friday, the 5th of March, 2021. So festivals in general aim to enable us to focus on outer experiences, whether they be seasonal or historical events, and uncover the spiritual nature of these events. Then further to that, we aim to connect our spiritual experiences as human beings with these external spiritual happenings. How can we connect? It kind of helps us connect with the world around us, with history, with future, and with each other. It's kind of a connection thing, being a human, connection. Today I'm talking about Easter, like I said, and the questions of how we can approach the festival when we have students in our class or homeschool groups that are from different faiths. So we know there are 3 big Christian festivals, Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost. 2 of these festivals acknowledge the 2 archetypal human experiences of birth and death. And then Pentecost is an interesting one, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult to explain. But it's kind of an extension of the Easter rebirth theme. And from my perspective, I see it as a festival where we acknowledge the human capacity to strive for peace, love, and universal understanding of all human beings. in Pentecost, we've got those symbols of the flame above the head, which symbolizes enlightenment. And then we have the dove flying around, which is a symbol for peace and connection. Both of these things are in the air, up above us in the sky, which again is like a symbol of being in the spiritual world. So, but we as human beings at Pentecost, well, all the time, we have our feet on the earth. So it's a striving to become enlightened, Anyway, Pentecost. Yeah. So let's start with Easter. We'll talk about Easter. Underneath the Christian narrative of Easter, so we've got Christ dies on the cross, then the Christ being descends into the earth to liberate souls that have been trapped there and to fight the devil, or what anthroposophists would call the Aramaic forces. And then he rises again after 3 days, transformed, and then Pentecost happens 50 days after that. Anyway, he does a whole lot of stuff after that, we all know. But anyway, the Easter festival, really, I see it as one where we can acknowledge the death force, really engage with it, and learn to see it not as an end, but as a transformation into a new way of being. Due to my spiritual belief and worldview, I see death as a door to a new beginning for many reasons, not just because I believe that we have an essential spirit self that is eternal, but also that I believe in reincarnation. And so there's a whole process you go through after you die so that you can be reborn again. That's my thing. But aside from that big final death with a capital D, we've got a whole lot of experiences in our lives where we go through kind of mini deaths in a way. We've got the whole thing where we go from being a child and move into puberty. That's quite a death process. And then there are multiple times where we change through our lives. We often hear people talking about shedding their skin and turning into like new and improved or becoming a new person. And then what else? I mean, we've got those lessons where we let go of old habits and behaviors and then become new versions of ourselves. And then, of course, we see the death rebirth cycle constantly in nature. I mean, as we're going into autumn, the death forces are becoming stronger. The light is getting dimmer. It's just all these things that we see that are physical, like representations of what human experiences we can go through. I mean, personally, I have a whole esoteric thought process on the whole importance of actually facing the threshold of death before I enter the afterlife. But that's my own personal spiritual path and meditative journey. So I'll just throw that in there. But as well as these metaphorical deaths and rebirths we experience in our lives, for children, they often face these things too. They've got death of pets and loved ones, and then they've got abrupt changes that often happens to children, like parents getting divorced or moving to a new place. Friendships change, and as they get older, relationships end. And then on a larger global or national global scale, there's always things like political upheavals and great world events that can happen suddenly and change the whole way that they live. So these death rebirth type festivals like Easter help us to find ways to communicate and discuss and express how we navigate the whole process of death. So we can give children stories and metaphors for helping. So we give children stories and metaphors for them to digest, which become part of their inner life. And when need be, they have these resources inside to call upon when they are going through a situation, which requires them to pull on that inner strength and know that this isn't an experience that's just individual to them, you know. A classic experience many people do in New Zealand, and I'm sure all around the world at Easter time, is have monarch caterpillars in the classroom on swan plants. And so then children can see the threefold process of birth, death, and rebirth. So it really clearly illustrates the death process of a caterpillar when it goes into a chrysalis. And I only learned recently that like when caterpillars go into a chrysalis, they like turn to mush, like they completely kind of disintegrate and then reform again. I'm like, wow, it's crazy. But anyway, and then they turn into butterflies. And then the butterfly metaphor is really beautiful too, because it's that kind of they very lightly touch on the earth, butterflies, but they spend most of their time in the air. And it's kind of like a representation of just what happens after you die. You've briefly touched on the earth and then you spend a lot of your time in the spiritual world, or yeah, it's kind of like a transformation to something closer to the light. And then in the autumn too, we see death forces becoming stronger. So the fruit on the trees ripen and then rot, and leaves fall. Lots of plants begin to die. But as the plant dies or the fruit rots, that's when the seeds are developing. And we see that the potential of new life is only enabled by death. So as macabre as it sounds, like I'm explaining it, for children to be able to see that there's a point to death and that it's not the end is really good for them. It enables new beginnings. So if we have it in the context of like a dandelion, when the dandelion is going to seed, we can see that one dandelion flower has the capacity to make hundreds of seeds, which then when blown away and fall on the ground, that they can turn into hundreds of new flowers. So children are able to see that although there is a sadness that comes with death, there's also a hope and there's an abundance that is then born out of it. So in the Northern Hemisphere, with it being spring, there's more of an emphasis on life forces becoming stronger. So instead of observing how the death forces affect the world, you're observing how the life forces affect the world. And from a holistic perspective, the entirety of human consciousness is experiencing the death and life forces at the same time, two sides of the same coin, which is quite interesting. And it's not exclusive to Christian festivals. So for people who have other religious and spiritual beliefs, it would be super interesting to hear about what you're observing while celebrating it in different parts of the world. How the underlying message of the festival that we're celebrating is represented by what is happening in the natural world. I was thinking how cool it would be if we could like make a database where we write down our observations of the natural world in our local environment, and then note what festival's being celebrated at that time. And the magical tarot reader in me says that if we did this, we could like collectively start communicating with the spiritual world more effectively, maybe, or more as a community, almost like our festival or ritual is the question and the observations that we make in nature are like the answers, or vice versa. And I'm sure this is what witches and shamans have been doing forever, but like I'm kind of imagining it happening at more of a global level in an interfaith way where we share our findings with each other. And perhaps this is already happening, but I think this interfaith dialogue aspect of it all is there's like something really important there that we need to consider. So those are my feelings about those are my thoughts about the whole Easter thing. I have more written here about festivals in general, but you know what, I think I might leave that because I kind of talk about it in that other podcast I did about festivals. So I think I'll just leave it there and have this as a super mini podcast about Easter and just contemplating how you approach it. I want to end it with ways of looking at your festivals and how you can consider making your festival celebrations more appropriate and what's the word? Appropriate and relevant to all the students in your classroom. These are the questions that you could ask yourself. So, what's the underlying and universal theme of this festival? What's going to change for the student? And what do I want them to learn during the festival celebrations? Are there other cultures, rituals, or festivals that share the same theme? Are the activities age appropriate? Are the activities inclusive for all my students? Have I called on the parent body and wider community for participation? I think this is just me putting it out here, and it might be a bit controversial, but I think we have to question the way we approach these three festivals of Easter, Pentecost, and Christmas in a school context or even a homeschooling context. There are some deep underlying themes that I think are really important, and I don't think they should be taken away from schools, but I wonder about making them school-wide and calling them Easter, Pentecost, and Christmas, and celebrating them in line with the Christian calendar. I just wonder about that, because I know that Steiner said that there should still be religious education in schools, but instead of it being like a class-wide thing, it should be more like a Jewish student should be educated by a rabbi. If the student is Buddhist, then they should have a Buddhist monk come and teach them and stuff. So he was saying that religious education is important, but students should be educated in the religious faith of their family. That's, which I think is quite cool. But then if you school-wide and community-wide make your festivals the Christian festivals, then without realizing it or not, you're putting those Christian festivals on a pedestal, because you're making those the ones that everybody celebrates. And then all the non-Christian festivals are more of the smaller ones. You're automatically kind of ranking them, whether you know that you're doing that or not. And personally, because I come from a perspective where the Christian festival, they're my faith. So I find them important for me personally and for my family. But I am also questioning how we do this, do this in a school context. There's just a whole lot of questions around these things. And as you can tell by my rambling, I don't have any answers, but they're things that I'm thinking about, and I think we should all be thinking about. And I'm not saying that you should necessarily throw out the whole school or homeschooling festival routine or anything, because I think that there's real importance in having the same festivals every year. I'm just wondering how we can develop them to make them more interfaith festivals rather than Christian festivals that are inclusive to other festivals. Can we change it so it's an interfaith festival that's celebrating an underlying universal human experience truly in an interfaith way? Like, is that even possible? I feel like it could be, but I don't have any answers as to how that we would make that happen. And so it's good to be having these conversations and hearing from people about how we can do that. And it's that question of like, how do you include and celebrate things or do things in a way that you have more than one perspective without having to like compromise or water down each different perspective. I was having this conversation with my son's kindy teacher, who is Māori, and she really likes Māori education, but she also really likes Waldorf education. It's that question of like, how do we combine the two so that both don't become watered down versions of each other, but they can become two strong pillars that are just equally standing together and creating this amazingly culturally relevant education system, and not becoming a Māori version of Waldorf. Because I think that, yeah, there's a whole question there. But yeah, anyway, I'm rambling now and I've got lots of questions, and I think that it would be good for you to have a little think about how you approach festivals in your school or homeschool group. And I hope this has been a relatively interesting podcast. I have a few more podcasts lined up for the year with some guests without me rambling on. And so I shall leave it there. So thank you for listening. Hit the subscribe button, share this around, follow me on social media. And yeah, I hope you're well. Have a great Easter. Send me messages with what you're doing. And yeah, go well, be safe. Ka kite anō. I shall talk to you soon.